What's going on, everyone? AP over here at Rumpier Sports, bringing to you once again the office hour shows, our partnership with Sabersim. I got my guy Jordan on here. Jordan, I gotta say, I just noticed this. Actually, I noticed it the last time we did the show, but your picture on here with me is just phenomenal. Drinking a beer and everything. I think I need a different photo on here. I'll have to get with Simon, our producer, after the show is going on. But what's going on, my man? How are you doing today?
I'm good. Yeah, no, it is a good picture up there. I think that's my Twitter profile picture. I think that's how that ended up there.
Very good.
So, yeah, good one up there. I'm doing good. Interesting day of baseball today. Two like slates with the 3-gamer in the morning and the 3-gamer in the night slate. But excited to kind of jump in and break down a little bit of my process of what I do on a typical slate here. So
yeah, interesting is a very friendly way of putting it because. Yeah. I would use the words terrible or a bunch of other words that align with that. But look, I mean, we've had a lot of success on these smaller slates. And what it allows us to do is walk through our process, which that's what we're going to do today. We're going to focus. I know I've done it a bunch of times. And I think, Jordan, you've probably done it on your own channel, Sabersim's channel, quite a bit too, but not on ours yet. So I'm really excited for you to walk through our process. We're going to pull up We're gonna pull it up here and do a screen share so that you all can see. Jordan, I'm gonna kick it right back to you. Let's walk through your process here, and then I'll just chime in every now and then and ask some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody that's watched the Sabersim office hours over on our YouTube channel, you're probably familiar with this, probably seen this before, but excited to bust this out for the Run Pure stream here. So we call it a research build is actually what I've kind of coined this phrase is, and it's a way of basically using the simulation data from these game sims and studying and researching the slate and figuring out how you want to use that to get an angle on the slate. So I'll just kind of walk through how it works. So it is actually a build that I run here. I'll turn this manual mode toggle on to see the sliders. And what I do to do this here is I'll turn correlation and ownership off. And I'm going to turn sim variance to 10. Let's put min salary to 0 here. And I'll explain why I'm doing all this here in just a second, but I want to show you how I get this all set up here. And this is basically how I kind of set this build up. And it's pretty important to understand what's going on here behind the scenes, starting with the sims, right? So one thing that makes Sabersim very unique here is that this isn't just an optimizer. We don't just have our own set of projections, right? We have play-by-play game sims, thousands of them for every game on the slate. And when your sim variance is at 10, every lineup is built using a single game simulation for every game on the slate. You're essentially building an optimal for one single slate sim. When we turn correlation and ownership fade off, we make sure that it's actually the optimal for that slate simulation, right? There's no correlative effects. There's no ownership fade effects. And I want to do this 1,500 times, right? I'm basically going to run a build here where I simulate the slate out 1,500 times and say, Sabersim, tell me what the optimal lineup was for that way the slate could play out. And I'm going to let this build here real quick to get this started, just because it is a 1,500 lineup build. It can take a minute to run. And I'll talk about what I actually end up doing here and using this for here once this gets finished. Hopefully we don't get stuck on 1 out of 1,500 here, but go ahead.
You call this a research build, right?
Yep.
That's okay. So not a final build. We're using this as part of our process to help dial things in, basically.
Yeah. Very important to note there. I think I've managed to confuse a few people at different times on our own streams with these. Yeah, this is so I call it a research build because it is purely just for research. I want to do this to get an overview of what the slate looks like. These are definitely not lineups you would want to take with you and play into the contest. So we'll let this wrap up the last like 350 lineups here. Any other questions on what this build is kind of doing yet before we move forward?
I'm kind of excited to see what I played around with Saber a bunch, and I'll do things like this with MLB, just because I like to get different. But no, I'm excited to see kind of what you're doing with this, because one thing I haven't done. Whoa. I guess I should take that back. I do use it for research purposes, but what I'm doing as part of my process, mainly for NBA, is I'm using it as when I'm looking at someone's projection, what number do they need to hit a high level of builds. So I'm using it to gauge like BigT talks about it a lot. Like if you have Giannis on a slate, who is the highest priced guy, what projection does he need to hit a high number of my builds? So that's how I'm using it, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet with MLB. So this is going to be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something went wrong on that first build I actually tried here. So I'm going to try to build another one here. The results on the other side of that didn't look right to me. So we're giving it another try. But what I'm basically going to do here, right, is I want to compare how often is a player showing up in the optimal lineup to how highly owned are they going to be on the slate. And I'm looking for opportunities where I can find pitchers or hitters or stacks that are going to be more likely to be optimal, more likely to be in the winning lineup than they are going to be owned. And this is kind of weird. It's weird that this build is coming out this way. Typically, I don't.
Because it's a three game slate.
Maybe it just seems, I don't know. I'm getting 100% exposure to Brad Miller in 1,500 lineups here. Let me jump back. Sorry for the false start here. I'm going to jump back to yesterday and see if we can do this for yesterday's slate here real quick, just so I can talk about what I'm doing here. But
this is another good thing to bring up, though. You can go back. So tell me if I'm wrong or right, but you can go back to a previous slate and kind of like reverse engineer things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, literally just change the day and the slate up top. If you want to go and mess around with yesterday's slate and see what you could have done better, see what you could have done different, I think it's a great way to just get familiar with the tools overall. Is just mess around with it, try some different builds, see what happens, change the sliders around a little bit, tweak exposures, things like that.
It's a fun thing to do with these 2-game NBA slates that we have right now. The reason being is because we're literally getting the same matchups each night. It is the same two teams playing each other. Pricing is different. And so you can go back to each one and just use it as a research tool to kind of look at, okay, here's what happened when, the games are in Boston. Here's what happened when, we went to Milwaukee. So kind of interesting. But no, this is really cool with baseball too. How does that look? Does that look better?
Yeah, this looks better. So I'm probably doing something wrong here on the slate here for today. So, but this looks a lot better, right? So here's what we got, right? We got 1,500 lineups. We built these on 0, 0, 10 sliders. So every lineup that's going to show up here is basically an optimal, the best lineup you could have made for a random one single slate simulation of the whole slate. And this exposure column here, the percentage of times that a player shows up in one of these optimal lineups basically is kind of an approximation of how likely that player is to show up in the winning lineup that particular night. And what's really useful about this is we can compare it directly to the ownership projection and start to get an idea of maybe where we want to take some stance. Where's maybe the field being inefficient with their ownership? So if I'm first starting to look at how I want to tackle a slate, right, I'll start looking for situations where the percentage of lineups that are going to roster that player and the percent of times where that player shows up in the winning lineup, there's a disconnect there, right? Guy like Miles Michaelis shows up here as an interesting one. 26% owned, 26.5% owned. We were projecting last night, only showing up in that winning lineup 18% of the time, though. And there's a 8-point discrepancy there. Ian Anderson's another one that's interesting. 8 projected point discrepancy there. And you can actually sort this leverage column here and find some creative plays that maybe the field wouldn't be on so much. So Wentz didn't work out last night, but the research build would be saying, the field's underrating him, only going to come in at 10% on. I actually think he came in a little higher, but that there's a 8 percentage point difference between how likely he is to be in that winning lineup and how owned he is. And I'll typically do this and try to come up with where do I feel like are the best leverage spots on the slate. So if it was last night, maybe I'd like to get a little bit of exposure to Wentz. Obviously, again, that wouldn't have worked out. And maybe some of my big pitching fades, maybe I'd be on the other side of Michaelis and Anderson and maybe play some Orioles stacks, get some Red Sox stacks going in there too. You can do this for the batters too. So let's look at the batters here, right? We'll do the same thing. Paul Goldschmidt, 23.4% owned, only showing up in the winning lineup 10.1% of the time. The Mets guys, Nimmo, Lindor, Marte, right? Discrepancies here of 6.5 to 7% of how often they show up in the winning lineup. And I'll do this and I'll kind of start. Let's actually look at the positive leverage here for the batters as well. So a couple stacks that pop here on the positive side, maybe a little bit of Washington. That probably would have worked out pretty good. Maybe a little KC Baltimore shows up here again. And I'll kind of start to take some notes. What are some teams that I want to be on? What are some teams that I want to fade? And I'll bring this back here to step one. And I'll start making some adjustments. So in that particular case, again, I know the A's went off last night, but I would have dropped them down a little bit, maybe get a little bit more exposure to Wentz there. I liked that Washington stack. So I shouldn't have hit yes yet because now it's going to take a second, but I like that Washington stack and I'll do my half run adjustments, right? So I always talk about how I like to do these half run adjustments. This is where I start, right? Red Sox popped up there. Baltimore popped up there. And I actually wanted to be on the underside on St. Louis. And I think that was it. But I'll take notes so I don't forget. Well, and the Mets. There you go. So this is kind of how I start, right? I'll do this research build. I'll get an idea of how often are players popping into optimal lineups. What is the field going to do with these guys? And then make some adjustments here. I'll apply those. And then I'll run a build on default settings with these new projections and see how things are starting to look. I got to switch over to the Sabersim projections to use those team totals. And now I'll come back here. And default settings now this time, not going to do that 0, 0, 10, but maybe we're building for 20 max, something like this. I might turn down ownership fade a little bit in this case if I'm doing some adjustments for ownership already on my own, maybe a couple notches. And now see what these look like. And, Sabersim kind of basically tries to do this a little bit for you. It compares a player's projection to and how often they show up in those optimal lineups to the ownership fade. And just by default, it's going to fade the ownership a little bit for you. But I like this approach because it lets me study the slate on my own. It lets me kind of determine where do I think the biggest leverage opportunities are going to be based on what's showing up in that build. So we'll let this build here for a second. Take a look at these lineups. Any thoughts, any questions there for that stuff?
No, I like that. And one thing we've talked about in the past is maybe a little bit different. That like there's a lot of similarities in our processes. That you showed right there. I think I get a little bit more aggressive on the adjustments. I like the half run adjustments though. Mm-hmm. One thing that you've always said that I'm excited to kind of dive into is, you do a lot of your adjustments too in step 3. So I kind of walk through and where do you start? Cause I kind of go straight to that. I think it's the teams, and that's always my starting point, which I'm fine with. But I'm really curious to see kind of how you start this off in step 3.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one way I'll do this here is I'll make sure I want to be getting exposure to teams that I just identified that I wanted to be on here in step 1, right? One of the teams that was popping that I thought was going to be over-owned was the Mets, and I'm still getting to like 45% of them here. That might be a team that right away, we already knocked them down a half run. They're still showing up in 45% of our lineups. They're probably a pretty decent play, but I might bring them back down a little bit more just so they're not one of my top stacks on the slate here. A team I really wanted to be kind of on here based on that research build, Washington, just barely showing up here at the bottom. That might be a team that, I pump up a little bit. And I'll just make sure that the list of teams that I'm getting here resembles what I got out of my research build here. I wanted to get some Washington. I wanted to be under on the Mets. Another team that popped up here, I wanted a little bit of Baltimore. Now, I don't need 40% Baltimore stacks, but I wanted to get a little bit.
Were you under on Boston too? Is that what you're saying?
No, I was over on Boston.
Over on Boston. Okay, that's right.
So that's a good one that's popping up there. Texas was one that I wasn't really kind of opinionated either direction. Might just leave them alone here, but I'll start, making sure that I'm getting exposure to the stacks that I thought were good leverage plays. And I think that's a good start there. Then I'll jump over to the pitchers too. And I'll check on the pitchers here. And again, I think let's go ahead and look this way.
Now, did you make any adjustments to your pitchers to begin with? Or do you just leave it be basically?
Typically, I won't really, in terms of like Xing pitchers out on step 1, I typically kind of leave it alone.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. I just, and that's generally true of a lot of the different sports for me is I like to leave all the guys in my pool. And that's the part on step 3 where I'll really, make some adjustments. But yeah, I typically leave a lot of these guys in my pool to start with. So.
Gotcha.
But yeah, let me go ahead and see if I can. Yeah, there we go. So pitchers, right? So, I said I wanted to get to a little bit of Wentz. Again, it feels funny doing this in hindsight because he got lit up last night. But if I was doing this, honestly, the way I would have played it, I would have gotten a little exposure there. Probably, Michaelis was one of those guys that really looked like a big fade on my research build. So I'll probably just cross him off completely. And make sure I'm just getting exposure to some of these guys that were popping up for me here. I'm not even opposed, if I'm taking a super strong stand against a really chalky hitting team like the Mets, I might play like a really low projected guy like Sanchez. Just let that trickle in there. And then I'll jump over to the batting exposures. For batters, I'm generally concerned about just spreading out the risk. I don't need 50% Marcus Semien, a guy whose most likely outcome is going to be scoring 0, just like every other hitter here. So I'll typically tone this down a little bit too here, get a little bit more flat exposure to my hitters in particular, maybe about 40% max or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good mention right there for sure.
Yeah, so and then I guess the last thing I'll normally look at is I'll take a look at my stacks here. I know people are getting a little bit more into these like 3-3-2s this year, just with hitting down a little bit. Some of these less correlated lineups doing well. I don't know if I'm bought in yet, so I still, especially 7-gamer.
We got to stick with it. It's starting to heat up. I mean, temperatures are up there. Let everyone else go to those weird builds with a bunch of random one-offs. I mean, maybe in in the 50K fields, can you make the argument in a 50K field, just max variance, or do you still prefer stacks?
No, I'm definitely still stacking up in a big field, large field GPT.
We align very much there. I'd love to see it.
So I might, I'll let a little bit more variety into my stack types if I'm playing a lot of lineups in a big GPP like that. Like I'll probably start playing just some of those like 5-1-1-1s, maybe like 4-2-1-1s, things like that. This is when I'm playing like 20 lineups or less, or a little bit smaller fields. These stack types are my bread and butter here. I stay 5-3, 5-2,
5-3, 5-2, 4. Okay. Now, what about, do you do game stacks at all?
Go ahead.
Or is that not as concerning to you?
I don't target them, and I don't eliminate them if I'm getting to some of them naturally. I pretty much just leave it alone.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah. Sometimes you get that game, if it's in a good park, good weather, it's a good hitting situation on both sides of the game. You get some game stacks to it, and I'm fine with that. But
are you messing around with the teams column then very much, or?
Yeah, definitely, to make sure that I'm getting the leverage on the teams that I want. I think that's probably where I'd start here. Right.
Okay. Gotcha. Because that's where I'm typically starting. And, the only times I'll go back to step one is if none of what I want is really hitting. So I think a few of the key things, important things that you said to do when you're doing this, one is 1,500 builds, right? Like make sure you have that massive pool to select from, and then you can dial it in step 3.
Yeah. So I two different things on that point. So for the original research build I used, this one, you really want to make sure you're doing the full 1,500, because what we're basically doing, we're trying to simulate the slate, and the more sims we can put in that bucket, the more accurate the information is going to be. So on that first research build, always 1,500.
For your final build, though, did you use a pool size of 1,500, or will 500 suffice?
I think I just did 500 here. So if I'm playing 150, I'll definitely bump that up and use the full 1,500, just so I have got a much bigger pool. If I'm playing 20 or less, I think most of the time I can get away with the 500. If you got the time for it, the more lineups aren't going to hurt. You've got more to work with in your pool. You can probably get away with a little bit more in step 3 here. But for 20 lineups, I think the 500 generally is good to get me by. So, cool. But yeah, I mean, so again, this is kind of, quick version of this. I'll scale this up a little bit more. If I have more time, I'll spend a little bit more time in the research build, maybe run a couple of them, see what's going on there. There's slates sometimes where I got to get this in 10 or 15 minutes. And I mean, we've been talking here for 20. I think this can be like a very quick way to get familiarized with the slate and find a little bit of an edge on the ownership side of things. I think too, on the run pure side, right? Like we've been talking here about the value of watching the streams, following along, making some of your own adjustments. I think if you run that research build on your own before the stream starts, right? Get your own kind of take on what you want to do on the slate, and then watch the stream to add some additional value there, right? See if the guys on the show that night have the same take as you do. Maybe they're on the other side. Maybe it gives you a little bit more of an idea of how you want to tackle certain things. But I think, for people, especially maybe even if you're somewhat new to baseball DFS and you don't really, you look at a slate, you sit down, okay, 7 baseball games tonight. I don't really know what I want to do. This can be a pretty good way to help you build some of that intuition for yourself of where some opportunities are.
Yeah, I like that quite a bit. And one thing tonight too, just to keep in mind when you're preparing. So we have 3 games. Is it automatically going to check that, the ability to play pitchers against hitters button, or how much is that going to come into play?
Yeah, good question here. So let me refresh this. It should automatically turn on for a 3-game slate. And I think that's a good thing for 3 games, right? You can get some lineups here where, the starting pitcher is generally not going to play the whole game. So you get some opportunities against the bullpen. Those lineups can kind of work out. They will only show up in your. And it's good. Oh, go ahead.
All I was going to say is it's definitely a slate by slate thing. Like we could see, like with how bad the Royals have been, like you could, with Dylan Cease likely to be a popular, number 1 pitching option, that's going to make these Yankee bats, potentially lower owned, but they're still like, I would take Yankee bats just with how they're hitting over these Royals guys, more often than not. So I do think this 3-game slate's an interesting one. I haven't fully dove in yet. I'm just looking right here on the surface. I do think there's some nice game theory to be had tonight. So it will be fun to dive in. Is that what you're pulling? Okay. Yeah. I see.
Yeah.
Pulling that up right now.
Yeah. So I was going to mention here. So that toggle does come on here, allow batters versus opposing pitchers. The nice thing about using the sims to power the lineups here is you're still only going to get that as often as that kind of lineup construction is optimal. So, if you did this with the traditional optimizer, you got to be pretty careful because all of a sudden now it's just going to pack in all the best projected plays. You might get, a couple, you might get 3 or 4 batters against your pitcher if you're not careful. Even when this is on, it'll really only show up a little bit here or there. You might get the occasional like home run upside one-off against your starting pitcher, which I think totally makes sense, especially in the large field stuff for a 3-game slate. Looks like I don't know. Maybe we got some news breaking or something live while we're on stream. I don't know if this is true, but Zach Wheeler is now marked as out on the projections here. So I don't know if he got scratched or something. Right before we started the stream, it was supposed to be Wheeler against the Dodgers tonight, and now he's showing us out. So maybe he got scratched.
Yeah, I don't have my alerts up right now, but if that's the case, we might get some chalky Dodger bats. Assuming we get a much worse pitcher that's starting over Wheeler. So yeah, definitely going to be interesting. I had a one question, unless you want to stay on baseball. So we were talking before the show. You mentioned that you had a nice night over there, NBA a couple of nights ago. Is that something we can go back and look at? Because we're getting the same matchup tonight. So this the Philly series and the Sun series. And if we go to the game that was on the 10th, I believe. I don't know if you
they're not going to be showing up here.
Okay. Gotcha.
I won't have my builds. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Cause you probably did it on your own, not through the access on our site. So gotcha.
But let's talk. Well, so one thing. So, and
I'm curious. I want to hear what you did though. Walk through that. Cause this has been the one series that I've personally struggled with versus the other series that we saw last night, because with Boston and with Milwaukee, we know the rotations. We know who's going to play. We know what minutes that they're going to get. And then with Memphis, we just had some obvious values that you just lock in. And so it was a really simple kind of equation. This series, though, we got Miami that, Max Stross was huge this last game. We got, Kyle Lowry out. We've seen different guys rotate in. So really curious to see your approach.
Yeah. I mean, so honestly, the actual the approach I take is pretty similar. I start with even though totally different sport, I start with that same kind of research build and just get an idea of where I think people are going to make some mistakes. My approach in a lot of DFS sports in general is trying to. I'll assume that the projections are pretty accurate. The ownership projections are pretty accurate, and just try to figure out, what's the optimal way to solve the puzzle, rather than trying to kind of guess at rotations and things like that. That's not as much my skill set there. One thing on Sabersim that I would recommend you do for these slates here. So we have this player filter button here, and you pop this up and you're going to see by default, there's a player filter that includes projections. And I think you talked about this last time we were talking about this here. My projection is greater than 15. I definitely recommend bringing this down. I've actually just been putting it at 0 for these because I want these guys in my pool, right? The rotations can definitely shake up a little bit. You get one right blowout and one of these guys plays 20 minutes or something like that. I want these guys to be showing up in my pool. I actually, for this here, we'll go ahead and set it at 1, just so we don't get those super low projected guys showing up.
Yeah, I mean, we saw 2 blowouts during this slate. So, I mean, that would have been huge to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, my nice night was 2 nights ago, and I ended up with the right lineup in the right contest where I had Landry Shamet and Paul Reed both in the lineup, right? Because both guys just got some run in games that got a little bit out of control there. And you wouldn't get exposure to those guys here with that default min projection filter there. So I do think it's a good value to add those in there. But honestly, apart from that, I didn't have much of a crystal ball on those 2 names at all. I think I had like 5% exposure to each of them anyway, and got kind of lucky with the way the lineup came together. I start my basketball slates here the same way. I do this for almost every sport. I love this kind of thing. Is I'll build these 1,500 lineups, and I'll just see, how often are these guys showing up in the optimal lineup. And I think it's just something that is, if you're used to staring at projections and used to staring at ownership, you can build an intuition for what's the probability of these events if you've played for a long time. But just having these raw numbers in front of you and having Sabersim kind of help calculate this out with the sims is just so valuable. And let's look, since we got a little time here, let's look at like how this is looking here for tonight's slate, and I'll show you what I'm looking at. So I'll do kind of the same thing. I mean, a guy that immediately pops off here, Brunson showing up in 52.5% of all the optimals we have here, only going to be in 33% of the lineups at the moment. I mean, he looks like an elite play. Tobias Harris, who I always feel like is under-owned every single game, is another name that's popping up here. And actually, I mean, you can do this in reverse too, right? Look at the guys that are coming in the other side. If everybody's playing Reggie Bullock, right? I love the idea of playing a little bit more Brunson there. They're probably have that negative correlation there a little bit. Not so much, but.
So with NBA, how would you make that adjustment? Would you bump up the individual projection relative to the guy you want leverage on?
So on NBA, I'll typically start with a little bit of a lighter touch. So what I'll actually do here is I'll do the same thing where I'm typically trying to write down, a handful of names, a few guys that pop to me as really, really good plays that I want to be on, a couple plays that I maybe want to fade a little bit more. And then what I'll do from there is I'll actually just first start with a build of like, what would Sabersim just give me here if I left it alone? And I'll see from there, what do I need to do? What do I need to make adjustments to? And then, if I want to make some adjustments, if I decide, I think I need to give this guy a little bit of a bump to get more of him in my lineups, maybe it's like Tobias Harris. I like 10%. So similar to my like half run rule on the team totals for baseball, I like 10% for basketball. So Tobias Harris, maybe, 3.5 point jump, something like that.
Gotcha.
And I'll give him a little boost. Where's Reggie Bullock, right? So maybe drop him down to 20 points. And you don't need a lot here sometimes with these guys. 10%, it gives them a pretty decent shock to how they show up in the lineups. And if you're still getting them, or if you're still not getting enough of them, sometimes that's a good signal too, that like maybe that guy's just not a great play. If you bumped his projection by 10%, you're still not getting him. Maybe you want to get off him, but that's like typically where I kind of start here.
Gotcha. So we did have one question from Dante Jones. Since the sliders are set for the set number of games on a slate, what's a good way to adjust the sliders when getting multiple postponed games? So MLB question.
Oh, good question. Yeah. So typically what I'll do there is let's hop back over to baseball. So first of all, I think it's really only something you need to worry about if you're getting to the point where like the slate has changed significantly. If you get one game that gets rained out, I would just stick with the same sliders you would have had anyway. One game difference on the size of the slate's typically not going to have a huge impact, but I know like about a week ago, we had that crazy slate where there were like 5 games that all got rained out. Slate went from like an 11 game slate to a 7 game slate or something like that.
Yep.
I think the easiest thing to do, and it's a little bit tedious, but I'll just go back and look at past slates and just find a slate that has the right number of games and check what the sliders looked like on that slate. So if it was supposed to be an 11 game slate and it became a 7 game slate, I'll just go and look on the most recent 7 game slate. What are the sliders that I'm supposed to use and write them down? So maybe 8, 5, 7, write them down and use that on the current day slate. Little tedious. Gotcha. We're planning on just fixing that in the future, just so that the sliders update to the actual new size of the slate. But for now, that's the easiest way to do that.
Oh, I like that. Very good. Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay. Yeah, no, I think we're good. Just a lot of, so Josh Gilham said Wheeler is starting. So I'll be interested. I mean, we're so far off from lock. It's not really
Wheeler is
that big of a deal. Not big of a deal. Well, I don't know. I don't have that information in front of me. It's still a ways away. So gotcha. Maybe that's something on the. Let's see. I'm still showing him starting.
Oh, interesting. Maybe I had the wrong info here. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Anyways, it's still a long ways from lock. So, yeah. I still think it's an interesting slate tonight for sure.
It is. Yeah. I think the last note I was going to make, and I know, getting a little long on time here, but I love doing those builds for golf too. Thought I mentioned that because I know you're a golf guy. One of my favorite sports overall to run those kinds of research builds there is with golf. Can be a really good way to get an idea of, maybe some inefficient ownership one way or the other on some of these guys.
Yeah, so. Run it real quick on golf, but use the Saber projections if you want to swap it there.
Okay. I think so. I actually think it'd be a little bit more interesting. Is there a reason you want me to use the Saber projections? I think it'd be a little bit more interesting with the Run Pure ones.
Let's do it on the right. Ours tend to be a little bit more aggressive.
Okay, that's no problem. That's fun. Let's see what it comes out as here. The reason I want to use the Run Pure here, and actually I think it's a good point worth making, is for golf in particular, the way that we actually generate our ownership projections is very similar to this process. So if we do this, sometimes you might see, hey, well, there's no ownership. There's no inefficient ownership on the slate, because that's actually part of the way we come up with our ownership projections. So on other sports, we have a little bit more of a robust system there, but let's take a look and see what this looks like. I think this can be a really cool. This can be a really good sport to do this with.
Yeah, he was on the COVID list, so and they're expecting him to be cleared. So that's probably why on the back end it initially showed that.
Gotcha. Well, I think that's an interesting spot tonight, especially if the Dodgers get kind of chalky. I don't know if you'd be on a pitch count or anything like that. Maybe something to look into, but yeah. So definitely getting a little bit of an aggressive stand here right off the bat with 6'8" Nate Lashley showing up as one of our most likely to be optimal plays here. But hey, maybe a good opportunity to get an edge. But again, when you say optimal, how much is that, like, almost like a chicken and the egg kind of conversation when we're talking about the projections versus, because if we did the same thing using Saber projections, it's going to produce a much different result, right? Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah. Okay. It is. And then that's where it gets tricky. It's a way to approximate how likely these guys are to show up in the optimals. But obviously, if you're wrong, you're wrong. If the projections are a little high on a guy, it's not going to be the accurate number here. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I do.
So this is a way that Saber uses to develop ownership projections also. Is that right?
It is, yeah. And we're actually we're doing some work right now on the ownership model. So that may not be true for that much longer. Planning on some improvements to the ownership model overall. But yes, at the moment, the way ownership is generated on Sabersim is for most sports, we take an industry aggregate projection. And then we basically do something very similar to this. We'll build a ton of lineups at a pretty high variance setting. And however much a player shows up in those lineups becomes their ownership projection. So if you do this kind of build with Saber projections and just Saber ownership, you might not get the most out of that.
Okay, gotcha. No, interesting.
But anyway,
I can go over my process sometime with golf. We definitely. I'm doing a lot of cuts and I think, and I have my own and it's right, wrong, or different. But I have my own projection scale. It's like a 0 to 10 scale, and and it's more so. I am trying to have more say over where, what my ownership is on a certain guy and what my mixed and matched guys are. So I'm trying to really dial in my player pool while you're trying to kind of, I think, maybe take more advantage of kind of the high variance of a sport like golf.
Yeah, 100%. We've talked about that before. I think it'd be fun. I'll come back on and you can show me what you do for your golf process, and I can talk a little bit about mine, because I think we both do really different things, which might be kind of cool for a stream. Yeah,
that's a really good idea. We'll definitely do that.
We got a major coming up next week. Maybe we find some.
Yeah, we can do that for next week. Yeah, that'll be a ton of fun. Yeah, we'll put that on the schedule. No, this is good though. Is there anything else that then you do? Kind of, we got a few more minutes. For PGA, from doing this, or are you? One thing the very first thing I do, and we'll go into this more next week, and we can save a lot of it, but there are just a lot of guys down there in the low 6K range that literally have like zero chance, like Justin Leonard from this week. That dude is, he like, I don't even know how he's in the field. So I mean, okay, so you're banking on that just, he's not going to come up anyway because the projection's
he's so low. Yeah. It's like he has a 0.5% chance to show up in the winning lineup. So yeah, I'm probably a guy that I wouldn't even get to at all. But yeah, no. So, I mean, the way I'll typically end up doing this, so I like having kind of a variety of different exposure and being pretty diverse with my golf lineup. So, but I'll use this to figure out where do I want to take my biggest stance. So I actually didn't play this week's event, but if I had, with the way that this came out, Justin Thomas, probably a guy that I would have been pretty far under on if he's only showing up here in this example build 10% of the time in the winning lineup, 31% owned. I think that's actually about what he came in at too. I'd be on the underside of that, but I'm less likely to. I will take a little bit softer stands on my guys when we're talking PGA. So I probably still would have exposure to a guy like that.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. Cool. No, this was good. Yeah. Next week we'll do, just thinking about, PGA Championship.
Yeah.
I think doing a golf, we'll walk through our process and everything. And so we'll have to bump, maybe on Wednesday we can do the show. We'll talk to producer Simon. We'll get it scheduled in and everything, but I think that'll be a great idea because, lock's going to be obviously Thursday morning.
Yeah.
So maybe Wednesday we can lock that in. No, this was great, Jordan. If anyone, if you ever have any questions, we have a Sabersim channel in our Discord. Go there, shoot me a DM. If you want us to cover something on these shows, we'll make sure that gets covered. But or you can always send Jordan a message as well. So, any final thoughts?
No, I think that just about does it. I mean, if anybody ever has any questions for me, feel free to fire away. My process always kind of is evolving as well. So I'll switch things up. I'll do things a little bit different depending on the slate. So I'll always happy to chat if anybody has any questions.
Yeah. And if you're new to this, as always, there's look for those quarter mania or, the 50 cent, 25 cent contests. something cheap or the $1.20 max and play around with some of these concepts. Sometimes it's best to do on these smaller slates. I've found. So I'm going to be doing that tonight. I don't feel like this is like a slate that I want to like max out. Some people might. I'm just a little bit different there. It's a slate I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to test a few different strategies and have some fun with. But yeah, no, very, very good. Again, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It helps us out a ton. With that, we are out of here. Rum Pier.